Good afternoon and welcome to this session of the Washington History Seminar, Historical Perspectives on International and National Affairs. This afternoon, we will speak with Yale University's Beverly Gage about her new biography of J. Edgar Hoover, G-Man, J. Edgar Hoover and the Making of the American Century. This is the book. And we will be joined by historians John F. Fox and Ellen Schrecker. A warm welcome to all of you to the Washington History Seminar. I'm Christian Ostermann. I direct the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program, and I have the pleasure to co-chair this seminar series with GW's Eric Arnesen, who represents the AHA. Today, Eric will introduce our speakers and moderate the discussion. The Washington History Seminar is a collaborative effort of our two organizations, the American Historical Association and the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program. For well over a decade, the seminar has served as a nonpartisan forum to discuss important new historical findings, insights, and publications. Behind the scenes, there are two individuals who helped produce this event, Rachel Wheatley for the AHA and Peter Bierstecker for the Wilson Center. Our thanks to both of them. We'd like to acknowledge our supporters, and we welcome your support. Details on how you can support the seminar are available in the chat right now, or simply go to our institutional websites. I'd like to invite you to join us for the last session of the semester next Monday, December 19th, for a roundtable on Mark Silverstone's The Kennedy Withdrawal, Camelot, and the American Commitment to Vietnam. And finally, a word on Q&A and the discussion that we hope will involve many of you in the audience as well. Today's session will be recorded and will soon appear on our respective organizations' websites. For the Q&A part of this session at about 5 o'clock or so, maybe a little bit before that, there are two ways you can intervene in the discussions we're having in the Zoom room. Our preferred way for you to do that is to use the raise hand function in the Zoom functionality. You'll be queued once you press that button, and then the moderator will call on you and ask you to unmute yourself. Please do that, otherwise this will be not successful. The other way you can join us is by posting a comment or question in the Q&A function, and then Eric today will put your comment to our panelists. I think that's it. With that, I'll turn the Zoom room over to you, Eric. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Christian. I have to say I have been looking forward to this session for some time. So it is my pleasure to introduce this afternoon's author, Beverly Gage, who is professor of U.S. history at Yale University. She's the author of The Day Wall Street Exploded, A Story of America in Its First Age of Terror. She writes regularly for publications such as New York Times Magazine, The Washington Post, and The New Yorker. From 2017 to 2021, she served as director of Yale's Brady Johnson Program in Grand Strategy, and in 2021, President Joe Biden nominated her to serve on the National Humanities Council, the advisory board for the National Endowment for the Humanities. And as you all know, today she will be speaking on her new book, G-Man, J. Edgar Hoover and the Making of the American Century, published just last month by Viking. Beverly, welcome to the Washington History Seminar.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here. And it's particularly great to be here with this group for a number of reasons. First, both Ellen Schrecker and John Fox were integral parts of the making of this book, and I'm eager to hear what they have to say, though they have read earlier drafts in various forms. It's also great to be here with Professor Arnesen as a representative of George Washington University, which was Hoover's alma mater, and which plays a pretty big role in the story of his life and the history of the FBI, and then to be at least virtually in Washington more broadly, because if this book is anything It's really a Washington book. Hoover was born in Washington to a Washington family, and he lived his whole life and made his whole career in Washington, died in Washington, and is buried in Washington. And that was one of the appeals of Hoover as a subject, was to have a chance to study the transformation of a city, of a national capital, in many ways, what becomes a global capital over the course of his life. So my instructions, I think, were to talk for about 15 minutes to give just a broad overview of what's in the book. And then I will pass it back. Does that seem like the right plan? Okay, great. GMan is a birth to death biography of J. Edgar Hoover, and it really therefore covers a pretty big span of time. For those of you who are not deep in Hoover history, which I suspect maybe many of you, thank you, Ellen, for holding up the book. Actually, the best part of the book, if you turn it on its side, is that Hoover's eye looks out at you from the spine of the book. So I warn you, if you buy that book forevermore, as you all should, you will be stared down and watched by J. Edgar Hoover. But Hoover was born in Washington in 1895. He died there in 1972. And for most of that time, from the years 1924 to 1972, he was in a single job. And that job was running first the Bureau of Investigation and then what we know today as the Federal Bureau of Investigation, or the FBI. And so when I began to think about this project, which I will now admit was quite a long time ago, I formally promised my publisher that I would write this in 2009. So it has been more than a decade of my life that I've been thinking about Hoover, working on this research and writing. But one of the first things that drew me to Hoover as a subject was simply that sweep of time. The fact that he was really interesting and important as an individual, but that he was also a really interesting way into thinking about some broader themes of American politics and government in particular, as they evolved over these critical years of the 20th century. The title of the book, which is GMan, J. Edgar Hoover and the Making of the American Century, tries to convey all of that. GMan is the nickname that was applied to FBI agents in general, and Hoover in particular, really beginning in the 1930s. And it stands for government man. At some moment, I being a kind of nerdy historian, tried to persuade my editor that government man was really the right title for the book. And she was like, that's definitely not the right title for the book. So we have G-Man, which she was right about. But this idea of Hoover as a lens into thinking about government, about the administrative state, and particularly about the growth of the federal government and the security state within that was one of the key impulses behind my interest in the book. I first encountered Hoover as a historical character, not as simply the kind of villain of legend, when I was working on my last book, which was a study of a bomb attack on Wall Street in 1920 that was suspected, and I think rightly suspected, of being a radical bomb attack. And he was there as a very young man, as a 24, 25-year-old, helping to orchestrate that investigation and also helping to orchestrate some of the early anti-communist campaigns that made up the first Red Scare and the Palmer raids. And a couple of things struck me in that moment that led me into this particular book. One was the enormous continuity in his outlook between that moment in the teens both in terms of his the kind of work that he was doing and in terms of his grappling with the question of communism, anti-radicalism, which in many ways I think is the central political theme of his life. And I could see that happening very early on there, and you could sort of see the ways that that was going to go on to shape so much of American politics. So he seemed to be a way into thinking about some of those broader continuities rather than splitting the 20th century in the 1930s, say, or in 1945. Hoover gave a way to think about the totality of this period, beginning in the teens, begin to think about the influence of the progressive era on these later moments. That was one impulse. A second was that even then, many of the initial generation of biographies of Hoover were starting to become a little bit dated. They had mostly come out in the late 80s and early 90s. And there were lots of innovations that I thought could be taken advantage of. New records that were released by the FBI itself through the Freedom of Information Act, particularly in the wake of the end of the Cold War, and whole new bodies of scholarship that had come out, hopefully by many of the people who are out there in the audience, certainly by many people sitting here on the panel, that seemed to want a new interpretation and a new synthesis, a way to kind of draw them together. And then finally, I was really interested in Hoover himself. Because he had been portrayed, and I think is still pretty routinely portrayed, as perhaps the greatest villain of American politics in the 20th century. And the historical reading that I was doing and the work of many other historians suggested that, he might be a villain, and this is a critical biography of Hoover for sure, but that he was someone who really deserved, A, to be taken seriously, and B, to be put kind of back in the center of our political story and not left as a man kind of alone in a dark room, a rogue actor manipulating everyone around him. So for those of you who have engaged the book, you'll see that a lot of it is attempting to push back a little bit against certainly in our popular narratives, a relatively one-dimensional portrait of Hoover, and to think about his role within the government and within the state over the course of this period. I'm going to just say a few brief words about what is covered in the book, and then a few other words about some of the themes and historiographical questions that really drove me in the end and that I found most interesting about Hoover. So the book is, I should note, rather long, but it's, I hope, pretty engaging. And the book is long, but the chapters are short. So it is a book with 58 chapters, plus an introduction and conclusion, but it's fundamentally analytically divided into 4 different sections. The first part of the book, which covers the years from Hoover's birth in 1895 to his appointment as director in 1924 at the age of 29, really covers his early years in Washington, looks at the ways in which his family, his upbringing in Washington really fundamentally shaped a lot of his outlook going forward. It was particularly interesting to me to situate Hoover within a Washington tradition of career government service, which even in the late 19th century, his family is engaged in. And people all around him are thinking about federal government service, federal power, at a moment when it doesn't quite amount to much yet, right? Late 19th and early 20th century, but is on the cusp of really, really mattering in profound ways. And the other is the tradition of Washington as a Southern city that is actively going through a process of racial segregation during his childhood. And the book particularly looks at the fraternity that he joined as a student at George Washington University, a fraternity called Kappa Alpha, which had been founded in the wake of the Civil War, was quite explicitly dedicated to a set of segregationist lost cause ideas. Its most famous member, alum, when Hoover joined, was Thomas Dixon, the famous novelist who wrote the novels upon which Birth of a Nation was based. And so Hoover really grew up in this world of segregating and segregationist Washington. And I think it put a deep stamp on his racial outlook, as well as his actions from that point on. So also in that section, we trace Hoover's very early career at the Justice Department. He happened to graduate from law school at the moment the United States was entering World War I in 1917, went into the Justice Department, where he first worked on German internment, something we don't think much about, but was going on during the First World War. Went on to be a leading kind of backroom architect of the Palmer raids and the first Red Scare, and then became assistant director of the Bureau in the Harding administration, and had to kind of make his way through and around the scandals of those years. So that's piece one of the book. Part two really looks at the years from 1924 to 1945, which are institution building years for Hoover. He spent his first decade as director, really trying to reform and professionalize the Bureau in lots of ways. He has a very particular vision of his core of agents as white-collar professionals, lawyers, accountants, men who ascribe to a particular kind of professional identity within the government, and a particular pretty conservative cultural view. And he is very self-conscious about choosing men who are a lot like him to help him do the institution building work of creating this bureau. So in the 1930s is really when he begins to, I think, acquire both the duties and power that become so essential to his later life. It's really Franklin Roosevelt as president who helps to expand the FBI as something like a New Deal alphabet agency. The FBI expands its criminal law enforcement dramatically in the 1930s, most famously in its showdowns with figures like John Dillinger. And then as the war comes along, becomes a domestic intelligence force as well, again, supported pretty widely by the Roosevelt administration, as well as by a lot of the Washington establishment. So by the time we get to that section, many elements of the FBI are built. Its essential record, its essential range of duties are in place. It has expanded enormously during those years, and Hoover has kind of built the institution in his vision. So that's the period up to 1945. Part three really looks at primarily the Red Scare years, looks at the late 40s and into the decade of the 1950s, from 1945 to 59, which in many ways were Hoover's most powerful, most popular, most influential years. Couple of things to say about that. One is that I think it is easy from our vantage point to forget just how popular J. Edgar Hoover actually was for most of his career. And a little bit of that was based on the fact that people didn't know everything that he was doing, but most of what he and the FBI were doing, and certainly a basic set of priorities, the anti-communist campaign in particular, was incredibly popular in much of the country. And Hoover's approval ratings during those years got into the 70s, 80s, 90 percentiles among Republicans, among Democrats. And that was interesting and a little bit surprising to me. I think the other piece that's really critical about Hoover and that Ellen Schrecker has written about so powerfully is that he is kind of the institutional core of the Red Scare. So you think about Hoover in comparison to someone like Joseph McCarthy. You know, McCarthy comes and goes. McCarthy is sort of a demagogue and a showboater. Hoover is there conducting anti-communist work for at least a decade, in many ways even more than that, before McCarthy comes along in 1950. He's there through the McCarthy years, actually building all sorts of interesting relationships, not only with McCarthy, but with other committees in Congress doing this kind of work. And of course, he outlasts McCarthy. McCarthy's censured in 1954, dies of alcoholism by 1957, and Hoover goes on for much longer after that. His relationship with McCarthy is also very interesting. We tend to think of them as being roughly the same guy, right? The same sort of figure. But in the politics of the 1950s, they were often perceived very differently. And though Hoover had plenty of critics on the left, within the Eisenhower administration, to some degree within the Truman administration, he is really promoted as the kind of responsible anti-communist alternative to McCarthy, is critical of McCarthy in certain ways, and is in conflict with him as well. So that's part 3. And then part 4 gets into the period that I think most people know best, which is the period of the 1960s, the FBI's investigations of political movements, social movements in that period, the civil rights movement, the New Left, the student movement. It also documents what I think are often more surprising campaigns by the Bureau against right-wing and vigilante groups like the Ku Klux Klan, various neo-Nazi groups. I would say of all the presidents that Hoover served under, and he served under 8 presidents, 4 Republicans, 4 Democrats. The presidents of the 1960s are probably the most interesting relationships. So there's a lot of material there about his very fractious relationship with the Kennedy administration, his much more congenial relationship with both the Johnson administration and the Nixon administration. And we kind of finish up with his death in 1972, but also some of the consequences that roll out from that. Watergate on the one hand, and the FBI's role there, and then ultimately the Church Committee investigations of the 1970s, 75, 76 into 77, the reforms that come out of that, and the ways that those really shaped Hoover's legacy. I'll just say a couple of last words here about themes that became particularly interesting to me. And the real political puzzle of the book, or what I'm trying to sort out historiographically and also politically, is that I situate Hoover as being the embodiment of 2 political traditions. On the one hand, a sort of, we might say liberal, but certainly progressive era tradition of an embrace of professional government service, of a certain kind of career identity, of scientific methods, of efficiency, of bureaucracy, of the administrative state, of the power of the executive branch. And he's deeply rooted in that, even before he comes to the Bureau, and particularly in the early years, really does shape the Bureau in that vision. And then on the other hand, he is a very powerful, extremely outspoken social conservative on issues like crime, which he tends to describe as really a challenge of individual morality in many cases, crime, law and order, communism, race, religion. You know, even though Hoover is the FBI director, right, a federal law enforcement official, he spends a lot of his career kind of being a cultural icon and intervening, lecturing the nation about the importance of going to Sunday school, for instance, and laying out a set of political priorities, many of them quite conservative in nature, and a particular vision of the American way of life. And so the puzzle of the book is to put these 2 things together. I think that's in many ways a political puzzle in our own moment when certainly in the Trump era, but I think in many ways before, conservatives are often described as being somehow anti-statist, but here is an incredibly powerful conservative really at the heart of the New Deal state, the liberal state, in the age of liberal consensus, right? Our chief policeman and domestic intelligence figure is this powerful conservative. And then I think historiographically, it allows an opportunity to bring together two really rich fields of historical inquiry that have developed in parallel, but often haven't been talking to each other a lot over the last 20 or so years. One is the field of American political development, studies of the state, studies of bureaucracy, bureaucratic autonomy. And the other is the wealth of work that's been done in the history of conservatism, in developing a really rich and nuanced history of the American right. These have both been really powerful and influential fields over the last 20 or 30 years, but in surprising ways, they haven't talked to each other a whole lot. And so my ultimate vision for Hoover is that we want to think about him as a conservative state builder, think about what a term like that might mean. And so that's kind of where I've situated him in the historiographical literature. And it's one of the puzzles that intrigued me from the first, and I think, intrigues me now 13 years later at the end of the story.
Thank you very, very much, Beverly. Our first discussant this afternoon is John F. Fox Jr., who has been with the FBI since 1999, and he was named FBI historian in 2003. He received his PhD in modern American history from the University of New Hampshire in 2001 and an MA in political science from Boston College in 1993. His articles have appeared in a number of journals, the FBI's websites, and other venues. And he's contributed chapters to several books, and he's the co-author of The FBI, A Centennial History. Dr. Fox has been involved in several cooperative museum projects, including the temporary exhibit on the FBI and the media that was on display at the museum from June of 2008 until June 2016, and various iterations of the FBI tour experience. He has appeared in many documentaries in the US and Europe, including C-SPAN, CBS Sunday News, CNN, and even Turner Classic Movies. John, welcome to the seminar.
Thank you, Dr. Arnesen, and thank you, Beverly, for this chance to speak about your book. I've been looking forward to it for some time because of the bits and pieces that you've shared with me over the years. So seeing it all come together has been great, and it's nice to see that you certainly didn't have a sophomore slump there with your second one. I love the way Dr. Gage put it in talking about some of the things she was trying to bring together. And I think one thing I'll start with, although she mentioned, kind of talking about that Hoover's family in the first part, her handling of both the family history of Hoover and the impact that would have had on the young Hoover, and of course his adult relationships, both friendships, whether they be political or personal, I think is one of the real strong points of this book. It shows a depth of research that other biographies haven't tackled. It brings a whole bunch of new approaches to looking at Hoover that go beyond, historically, of course, Hoover's sexuality was dealt with in terms of really just gay stereotypes, whereas Dr. Gage has actually taken this much more deeply to consider what Hoover's relationship, especially with Clyde Tolson, meant to him personally, and it's a real value to the book, including the development of his experience in Washington, D.C. is also an incredible strong point here, and how, in a sense, growing up in that environment of, in a sense, a government town, and doing so within the segregated government town that Washington was for so long, and the impact that has on Hoover's career is an insight that really on his personality has not been explored like in this book. Carrying it through, Dr. Gage hits on all the major stories. I can't think of anything significant left out, and you have to do that. And in dealing with this, it really raises some of the issues, certainly for me, of the problem of biography and history. And I've had some of these conversations, and some of them are probably better over a coffee or a beer after work. But, historiographically, biographies can be tough when you're dealing with an institution, because a lot of FBI historiography has been a conflation of Hoover and the Bureau. And Hoover himself, of course, presented that aspect of the Bureau. The G-man was faceless, whereas when everybody thought of the FBI, it was Hoover that they thought of. And so, he kind of came to represent the head of the Bureau. And so criticism of Hoover becomes criticism of the Bureau, and development of the institution is conflated with the development of Hoover himself. And there's certainly truth to be seen in that. And yet they are not the same. And I think especially bringing in the family and bringing in some of the personal nature of it suggests why that is. And I think that's important. I think in dealing with Hoover over time, another strong point of the book is the relationship with the presidents, especially as Dr. Gage noted, the 1960s presidents, and the personal relationships and the political relationships. And it's kind of unique again to Washington, where, politicians can, at least in the past, sometimes could be consider each other's good social friends and yet fight, head and tooth over certain policies here and there, and then pick up and actually cooperate on others the next day. There are stories of Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan in that sense, even though they were more disparate than either Johnson and Hoover, or Nixon and Hoover in some ways politically. These kinds of stories, again, add a nuance to the story of the FBI and to J. Edgar Hoover that I don't think was in past works. In that sense, though, I do wonder sometimes, and I don't get that impression from the book, that how much of this is Hoover? Hoover and the FBI obviously are not the same. What if somebody else was there? We could look at the 1924 to 1935 period when the Bureau's growing, and it'd be hard to imagine another individual creating an organization as Hoover and those Kappa Alpha agents that Dr. Gage talks about, created in that period. On the other hand, when we get into some of the later times, perhaps similar things would have happened. The CIA is doing some of the same things the FBI is doing. Army intelligence likewise is doing some of those same things. The presidents, and Dr. Gage, certainly brings this in. 4 Democrats and 4 Republicans generally supported Hoover, certainly publicly. They might have butted heads with him behind the scenes. And, in the earlier presidencies, Hoover may have been more deferential and supportive, or, basically you might go so far as to say currying favor, or at least support from the presidents, as opposed to some of the games he plays later on, like with the whole Houston plan, for instance. But all these things, I think, bring out a nuance that has been missing from these studies of the Bureau. And the Bureau is one of those organizations that has been written about so much. And the conflation, again, that of Hoover and the FBI, I think, creates issues because, one, we don't understand Hoover, or certainly haven't before in the fullness of who he was as a person. He was always a bit of a cipher in that regard. But 2, I think we need to begin to separate both Hoover and the Bureau, and, in some ways, perhaps the Bureau and the government. Washington, D.C. is an odd city in some ways. People talk about the Beltway bubble and the idea that, DC kind of has a culture of its own. I guess in that regards, I might have questioned Dr. Gage's publisher about the title of the Hoover in the American Century, because DC and America are not necessarily always the same thing. And, as much as Hoover spoke to America, and I think his popularity over the years suggests that, I think in the end, there is a difference. And people also recognize that. In some ways, it's probably why Hoover was able to become such a scapegoat, in a sense, post-Watergate, because of, one, obviously the things that the Bureau had done, especially in the 60s, but also because of changes in the way we wanted to think about things. That balance of liberty and security in domestic affairs is difficult sometimes because the American people demand different things, and that changes over time. And we see Hoover navigating that so well up until the 1960s. And perhaps that's eventually the story that gets told. And I like the way Dr. Gage tells that story. I think perhaps bringing in a little bit more about William Sullivan might have helped here or there, but overall, it is a story that tells us where our nation was going in trying to deal with the deep-seated problems of the South and the treatment of African Americans, of dealing with the end legacy of the Soviet penetration of the US government and the reactions that followed from that, and especially because of the lack of information that the American public had. McCarthy is in some ways a symptom of that. As Dr. Gage points out, Hoover knew about Venona, McCarthy didn't. A lack of knowledge ends up being a problem in itself, feeding that political culture of the McCarthy era that Dr. Schrecker's written so much about. So I'm at this point, I think I'm probably rambling, so I will turn it back to you, Dr. Arnesen. But it's certainly well worth reading, and it raises so many new things about Hoover that I look forward to reading it again. So,
thank you, Beverly. Any thoughts, if you wish to respond?
Sure. I'll just say a couple of quick things about biography as a project and as a genre, and the ways that I struggled with this. So I think Dr. Fox is right that it's one of the big kind of questions of the book, and that the genre of biography means that you're following a man who is running and embedded in an institution, but that they are not the same thing. And there were actually many moments where I wanted to take big detours into, the FBI bureaucracy, into the whole core of top officials, who they were, how they were relating to each other. And the nature of biography sort of structured that, militated against it. One of the things that did attract me to Hoover as a biographical subject is that if there ever was a true fusion between kind of the man and the machine, it was Hoover. But I also try to interrogate that a little bit as something that he also created and sold, that the FBI and its public relations apparatus was very diligent at kind of presenting and selling to the public. And the last bit that I'll say is, if I had more non-biographical room to write about certain other subjects, and this may be something that I do write about in an article or two. I got really fascinated by ex-FBI agents and where they ended up, because they just pop up everywhere. Right? So I do write a little bit about former agents who end up on the sort of right-wing lecture circuit and are these big pioneers there. But I kept running into them in Southern law enforcement during these years. They are really critical in kind of creating and maintaining the blacklist in Hollywood, and doing kind of freelance anti-communist work. But then they're all over the place, just doing basic security work, working in politics in various various ways going on to roles in the Justice Department. And I think that's something that we haven't spent a lot of time studying, not only the state itself, but the ways in which the state produces a set of skills and authority and legitimacy and expertise that whole generations and thousands of people then take into the private sector and make use of in various ways. So there are little snippets of that in there. I didn't get to write about it at great length because of the structuring power of biography, which is, I think, in the end, probably a good thing in this case, because there's plenty to get through already.
Thanks. Let me just take a moment to reiterate something that Christian raised. For those of you in the listening, viewing audience, if you wish to pose a question, you can use the raise hand function on Zoom. I will call on you, you will unmute, you will pose your question, or you can use the Q&A function, in which case I get to pose the question for you. All right. Our next discussant is Ellen Schrecker, an historian and author who has written extensively about McCarthyism, political repression, and American higher education. She holds a PhD from Harvard. She taught there and at NYU and at Princeton before ending up at Yeshiva University, from which she retired in 2013. Her latest book, The Lost Promise, American Universities in the 1960s, published in 2021, provides the first comprehensive analysis of American higher education's most turbulent decade, while her study of McCarthyism, Many Are the Crimes, McCarthyism in America, published in 1998, is considered the definitive work on that unfortunate phenomenon. I have to say, I have taught Many Are the Crimes and other works of Ellen Schrecker on numerous occasions over the years, including even this semester, at least one of her articles in a survey class. So I have learned a lot from you over the years. Ellen, welcome to the Washington History Seminar.
I am a person of a certain age who is a techno dummy of the first order. And so this kind of stuff sometimes evades me. But anyhow, I do want to thank you all for paying so much attention to this magnificent and rather weighty book. The George Washington University is a place where I have worked very happily in the archives, and the Wilson Center, of course, is a major institution, as is the American Historical Association. And I want to thank you all, but especially Beverly, for undertaking this massive project and producing a rather weighty book. I mean, Beverly, it's too big. What can I say? I couldn't take it on the subway. It's really heavy. And your publisher, in order to keep it down to only 700 pages, put it in the smallest type I have ever seen. And I had a great deal of eye strain and finally gave in and got a Kindle version. It was the only way I could get through your book, but it was incredibly rewarding. And I do think that there's something very important about the fact that it's a biography. Now, there are problems for a historian doing a biography, and my actual mentor used to look down on biography, thinking it was, too flashy, not serious history. It presented problems because you didn't control the structure of your book. You had to do 1942. And I recall from a conversation with the late, great Marty Sherwin, who wrote the definitive biography of J. Robert Oppenheimer, that he confided in me that he got stuck in 1937. He just couldn't stand writing about 1937, and it took him forever to finish the book. But what you do get, and what you yourself noted, with a chronological structure, you see the continuities. You cannot avoid, they jump out at you every few years. And that did allow you to give us that much more nuanced assessment of J. Edgar Hoover and his broader impact on American politics, because the same themes kept coming up over and over and over again. Now, what are these themes? Clearly, there's this concept of the administrative state, and he was the master. You used a term which I just love. You call him a master of bureaucratic virtuosity, and he really was. He knew how power operated, and he knew how to gain it. He knew how to keep it. And I think he viewed his mission as one, and viewed himself, I think, as, and again, this is your language, not mine, a conservative warrior protecting the status quo. And that really encapsulates what he did. He was fighting to keep change away, and encapsulated above all this notion of law and order, which is something that he emphasized throughout his career, and he viewed as an enemy disorder, whether it's disorder on the right or disorder on the left. He was against it. And certainly that sort of single-minded vision, I think, enabled him to build an institution, obviously the FBI, that more than any other dominated the American exercise of law enforcement in the 20th century. And I think that you show that probably more clearly than anyone else. And you show as well the complexity when his commitment to institution building conflicted with his own political ideology. I think the two were not the same. There was tension there throughout. And this has provided some amazing insights for me. I mean, I've been looking at the FBI for not as long as you have, but I began it a lot earlier, and really saw things that you were finding as incredible insights. I mean, yes, we all knew, we saw it, and particularly, I think, with the treatment of race in throughout his career. You know, it's sort of common knowledge that the man was a racist, but you gave him a sort of institutional racism from Kappa Alpha, his fraternity, which was carrying on the lost cause up until, well, we don't know if it's still around at George Washington or not. Maybe Eric knows. It's gone. But anyhow, but he was also a player in trying to combat racial violence, in trying to combat the Ku Klux Klan. And you make it fairly clear that he actually, through this terrible thing known as COINTELPRO, probably did more to destroy the Ku Klux Klan than any single individual. Often because he was ordered to do so by one or another president or attorney general. And that brings in, of course, the question of where he got his power. And quite a lot of it came from his relationships, his personal relationships that you and both John Fox have noted with presidents, beginning, of course, with FDR, who, focused throughout the New Deal on accumulating power within the executive branch. And this was something that Hoover, as a progressive, which you noted, very much was influenced by and influenced. But if he couldn't get along with a president, and I think the president he least got along with was Harry Truman, he could find other routes to power. You know, he didn't have to have Truman behind him. He could go to Congress. He could get support that way. He could go to the press. He was very good at creating alliances to accumulate power. He was also good at public relations. And clearly that popularity that everybody notes is something that he did brilliantly, although it wasn't something he wanted to do very much in the beginning. He just realized it was going to help, finally realized it was going to help him. And he creates this image of the apolitical G-man with an emphasis, efficient, with expertise, with an emphasis on technology. You know, the crime statistics, the fingerprint centralization. He's accumulating power here. And he's claiming that he's apolitical. Well, he's completely political, but not in the traditional sense. He also, I think, part of his power comes from his secrecy. He, above all, wants to maintain secrecy, and he keeps a lot of stuff secret from his superiors as well as from the American public. But I think one thing that I would have liked a little bit more of in the book was a sense for the limitations on his power, particularly on the sort of institutional structure of the FBI. It was designed to provide information for criminal prosecutions. And that meant there needed to be a law that he was enforcing. And a lot of the limitations that he overcame through secrecy, through the COINTELPRO program, were because there was no law that he could enforce. There was no law against lynching. There was no real law against being on the left, although he tried very hard to wiggle around that. And so what you see is a lot of rather devious behavior on the part of Hoover and his FBI because they couldn't do what they were supposed to be doing. And yet he believed so much in his mission of protecting the against the left that he did it. So anyhow, I think I probably am supposed to keep it short, and I will. I wanted to point out the two issues that I think he really, really brought to the fore in his legacy, as it were. One, of course, is the anti-communism. And I think I wrote a whole book in which I said, basically, my subtitle should not have been McCarthyism in American Life, but Hooverism. And I still believe that he, more than anyone else, is responsible for hyping the quote unquote dangers of communism and then really what I would say is kind of distorting American politics to make it so central to the home front of the Cold War, as it were. And the other one is crime. Initially, it was pretty clear he didn't want to get involved with crime, particularly. It was messy. There was violence. If he dealt with organized crime, there was a fear that his G-men were going to be corrupted by it. And later on, in the 1960s in particular, as he sort of identifies with law and order, you see his racism coming through. That the notion of law and order, the notion of eliminating crime is something that's really a kind of coded language about race, something, of course, that Nixon in particular picks up on with his Southern strategy, and which unfortunately has consequences for today. So I think I will leave it at there and open it up for more people and you to talk about.
Thanks so much. Beverly, thoughts, responses?
Yeah, I'll just say a couple quick things so we can start getting to the Q&A. One, I do think this question of limitations is really fascinating. And Hoover, of course, would often say when it was something he didn't want to do, no jurisdiction. And when it was something he really wanted to do, he would take a very capacious view of what federal jurisdiction might look like. But that said, those were real limits. And we, particularly in criminal law enforcement, where we have a very decentralized, very local way of doing business. And so I do think that it's really key to understanding both the ways he approached certain issues like organized crime, and then also the turn to secrecy. You mentioned COINTELPRO, which was a counterintelligence program. We can talk more about it in the Q&A, but most famous for the FBI's activities in the 1960s against figures like King, the civil rights movement, the Black Panthers, etc., but starts in the 50s as a program aimed at the Communist Party because Hoover is really concerned that both the Supreme Court, Congress, the public at large is turning against the anti-communist cause. He wants to keep it going. And so he decides that the FBI is going to have to do some of that on its own. It's going to have to do it through informers, through secret programs, through kind of making the party collapse from within. And that is a turn that you see a lot over the course of his career, the turn to secrecy when I think, as you said very persuasively, Ellen, there's a conflict between the power and the mechanisms that are actually available and the sense of mission, which often came from Hoover himself, sometimes came from public pressure, where the FBI was expected to do things that it actually didn't really have the jurisdiction to do. And so often that's where secrecy might come in. The other thing that I'll just say about the crime and communism were absolutely his two big issues. And I think with anti-communism, one of the big contrasts with someone like McCarthy is that he gave the issue and this very expansive view of what was required in order to fight communism, right? Not just espionage investigations or even investigations of the Communist Party, but an existential struggle at every level of life, right? That's how Hoover presented it. He gave that, because of his place in the state, a different kind of legitimacy than a figure like McCarthy could give it, and therefore, as you say, a different kind of influence. And the last piece that I will say is that on crime and thinking about the history of policing and crime, that was one of the places where this story of continuities was most fascinating to me, because we're seeing lots of really interesting work in the historical profession on the evolution of policing and mass incarceration, really starting in the 1960s. But for someone like Hoover, who had been through the 1930s war on crime, when he gets to the 1960s, he just says, oh, let's do all the same stuff now. Right? And so you can actually see what I came to think of as a long war on crime story that I think historians have only started to put together. And then again, that I myself may may ultimately write a little bit about, because it didn't quite fit in to the biography itself.
Thank you. We have a good number of hands raised and a number of questions in the Q&A. So remember, we call on you, you unmute yourself, you pose the question. And so waiting patiently in the queue, for starters, how about Dan Letwin? If you unmute, you can pose the question.
I can't hear him. I don't know if the rest of you can.
I'm sorry. Hello. I'll say it again. I've read your book with real fascination, and that speaks not only to the scholarly achievement, which it clearly represents, but also I've been looking at how I find my own soul very much tested as I read it. As one who's old enough to remember the living Hoover, or the dying Hoover, and the period through which he carried out those final chapters of his career, all my life I've nursed a hearty, a robust, and an ongoing hatred of the man. Hatred not only for his lack of sympathy for the causes of civil rights and other crusades for social justice and for peace and for the rights to critical dissent, but also his elaborate efforts to disrupt, to discredit, to undermine these movements, and at times even going to grisly extremes, of course, as in the case of King, whose suicide he took steps to encourage. And yet, as a historian, I feel constrained to respect context, and I have to respect the highly nuanced and contextual re-examination that you've brought, even though it kind of frustrates my visceral desire for a good old-fashioned hatchet job. So I guess what I'm getting at is to regard him as a villain, as I always have, is implicitly to say that in key ways, his aggressions against democracy and justice went further than the cultural and political pressures of his time necessarily dictated, right? That he had agency, that he chose from options. Perhaps another leader of the FBI might not necessarily have developed and sustained a program so insidious as COINTELPRO, for example. It's a long way of just opening up, kind of just putting out that question. What were your thoughts as you wrote this book on this question of, what were his options? What was his agency, particularly in some of the darker phases of his career in 20th century America?
That's a great question. I'll unmute myself too. Okay, I'm unmuted. It's a great question. And, I will say that I wrestled with a similar push and pull, in some fundamental way. I was really curious about Hoover, and I became most curious about the moments in his life when it didn't conform to what I might have wanted or expected. I tried to be fair in those moments and to really present this contextualized and sometimes, I think, pretty complicated and nuanced sense of who he was. I do think that there are some key moments when the fact that it was Hoover really does matter. One of those is in the 30s and 40s, when things have to happen really quickly in these moments of emergency. And it turns out that Hoover is actually a pretty skilled administrator. He can make his bureaucracy move. So when they say, carry guns, fight crime, when Franklin Roosevelt says, get John Dillinger for me, he's able to do it. And he actually has to do a lot of learning and a lot of training and a lot of pivoting in a moment like that. And you have a similar moment in the Second World War where the emergency comes. The FBI has to be transformed and built up very dramatically. And, I think a figure like Hoover, who was able to do that really quickly, is one of the reasons that he was able to last and stay in power. Couple of other moments where I think it would have been different. And one of those is certainly the Red Scare. And I think, in the early Cold War, you weren't going to not have a domestic intelligence agency of some sort in the United States. It wasn't not going to be, paying attention to the issue of communism, to the Communist Party, particularly to the question of Soviet espionage. But it's conceivable that a different director in that moment, who was much less committed to the anti-communist cause, would have taken it on as a much narrower national security matter, right? Would have done espionage investigations, maybe would have been looking at some of the interchange between the Soviet Union and the Communist Party. But that's not what Hoover does at all. Hoover makes it a massive political, social, cultural crusade, and his understanding of what the FBI needs to be doing, who it needs to be watching, is incredibly broad in that particular moment. And I think the same thing is true of the 1960s, the investigations of the civil rights movement and of the Black Panthers. If for some reason Hoover had not been the one in office, you had someone appointed to the FBI who was kind of a basic, maybe liberal-leaning law enforcement official. Again, I think you would lack this sense of, a crusade against the forces of disorder that are destroying America, and you might have had a much more contained and limited set of approaches there. Many things would have happened in some general sense. I think, we would have ended up with a domestic intelligence agency. We would have ended up with federal law enforcement. But Hoover's vision was often pretty big, and his ability to control the bureaucracy, I think, was really unique, because there were a lot of other bureaucracies that came and went. The CIA had a bajillion directors, right? They didn't last very long. Some of them were influential, and some of them weren't.
Thank you. Up next, Ellie Shermer, please unmute.
Sorry for the, can you hear me?
Yep. Okay,
cool. Thanks to everyone for this session, but of course, Beverly, thank you for this really timely and important book. And I was really curious, I was remembering that there was, for a time in the 90s and early aughts, a lot of books about people like Walter Lippmann in the American Century and Harry Hopkins in the American Century. And I'm wondering for you about how you've constructed this book and the themes that you've talked to us about crime, about American political development, about the history of conservatism, about how this biography of Hoover might change the way that we think about the American century, and actually maybe even the periodization that we're using about the 20th century, because you're really talking about a very powerful man at this sort of apogee of American liberalism through the 1930s to the 1960s. So I'm really curious about how you see this biography sort of intersecting with a lot of different discussions about just what was the American century and how we can actually think about the 20th century here in the United States because of it.
Mm-hmm. Great. What a small question that is. But of course, on some level, putting the American century in the title is just a shorthand way of saying the 20th century. So there is something a little utilitarian in that sense. But I think Hoover is really important on two questions. One is that his trajectory, his story, and particularly his origin story really situates the question of communism and the struggle against communism as being, if not the question of American politics in the 20th century, certainly one of the central questions. And as I think ahead to next projects, that's actually something that I would like to write and to take on to kind of give a total picture of this century in which that struggle, which was geopolitical, which was ideological, which had to do with domestic politics, foreign politics, had to do with the United States and the world, grassroots politics, high politics, was this kind of structuring force, not only for the United States itself, but for the way that the United States kind of begins to stride the globe in new ways. And in a funny way, I think that question has fallen out of our historiography a little bit, or is increasingly falling out. Not that people aren't studying it, but really thinking about the American century as being structured in many ways around that question, and then that being a question that actually had an end, right? So the Cold War came to an end, and we saw a whole new set of orientations, which is not to say we don't have people, accusing Joe Biden of being a communist or something, but in fact, the Soviet Union, the Communist Party, the basic ideological struggle of the 20th century is over. And so I think Hoover's really important for that. The second piece I would say is that he's really important for thinking about the ways in which that question, along with many others, drove the growth of the federal government over the course of the 20th century. And obviously, we have a lot of studies of the state. But one of the things that I wanted to do with Hoover was to bring our analysis of the security state kind of into conversation with and link it up with our studies of the liberal state, the social welfare state, to look at the ways in which they both grew with each other and were both really key to these projections of American power at home and abroad in this big sweep of the quote unquote American century.
Thank you. Up next, John Martin, and then Leon Fink, stand by. So John, join us by unmuting.
Thank you, Eric. I'm really looking forward to this book, and I probably will get the Kindle version for my eyesight as well. I spent 40 years as a journalist, both in California and in the East. I covered the Black Panthers for a while in Northern California. And I also was aware of what seemed to be Hoover's great relationship with the press. And I wonder if there's anything in the book about just how important that was. I know Walter Winchell used to come to San Diego so he could meet with Hoover at the Del Mar racetrack every summer, and I wonder if that was going on elsewhere in Hoover's life.
Yeah, Walter Winchell is actually a pretty big character in the book, beginning in the 30s. Hoover and Tolson and Winchell are hanging out at the Stork Club at 2 a.m., which is interesting both for press relations and for this whole kind of open but hidden social world that he and Tolson occupied. But the press is really key to Hoover's power in the 1930s. He sets up a public relations wing of the Bureau that is absolutely critical to what happens next. He ended up in his later years not himself liking to be in public all that often, but having very deep relationships with, for instance, the Hearst newspaper chain, Scripps Howard, some of the more conservative chains. And if you look at his phone logs, there's a whole period in which he's talking on an incredibly regular basis with a figure like Richard Berlin, who is the publisher of the Hearst chain. So the press is key, and Hollywood was key too. I mean, Hoover kind of lucks out in the 1930s when the film codes come in, because he is just becoming known as a national figure. And one of the film codes in Hollywood says you're not allowed to have the criminals win anymore. So he became a kind of easy hero to adopt under these codes that said the police heroes have to win.
Thank you. Leon Fink, please unmute.
Yes, Professor Gage, very much looking forward to jumping into your book. In response to Dan Letwin's question, you suggested there were a number of points along the way where Hoover had particular agency, whereas someone else, if it wasn't Hoover, they might have handled a number of important affairs differently. My question is to you is, if you looking back over this trajectory, who were Hoover's biggest antagonists that you've discovered, whether in the administrative state or in political affairs? And did any of them come close to derailing his important projects?
Mm-hmm. That's great. Well, it's a key question, and he had plenty of even at the height of his popularity, he had plenty of critics who spoke out publicly, but even more who were willing to complain about him behind the scenes, including some of his own officials. Of the presidents, I think the two moments when he could have been forced out, or the two moments that presidents wanted to force him out, one was Truman, who was concerned about concentrations of power at the Bureau. Hoover made a bid after 1945 to as the OSS was shutting down, to take over global intelligence and sort of fold it all into one super agency. Truman says no, and ultimately creates the CIA. The FBI had been running a South American, Latin American intelligence service during the war, had been in charge of the whole Western Hemisphere, and Truman makes him shut down that service, and Hoover is furious. He basically tells the FBI agents throughout Latin America to burn all their stuff and come home and leave the CIA to start from scratch. So I think Truman was a real adversary. One of the things, as Professor Schrecker suggested in her comments, that he does then in the 1940s is pivot toward Congress, pivot toward building up relationships with the Republican Party, toward groups like HUAC, the Appropriations Committee, the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee, and makes a real base of power for himself over there. Kennedy really didn't like Hoover. There's lots of culture clash, et cetera, during the Kennedy years. He doesn't actually get very far toward containing Hoover, in part because he's not really there for very long. And interestingly, Richard Nixon actually wanted to ease Hoover out in the end, and went so far as to meet with the 76-year-old Hoover for breakfast and say, "Don't you think it's really time to step down, Edgar?" Hoover basically says, "No, I don't really think so." And Nixon says, "Oh, well, okay, if you don't think so, then that's fine." And of course doesn't do it. So among the presidents, that was the case. Hoover was very aware of the civil liberties community throughout his whole career, was very concerned about criticism from civil libertarians and civil liberties-minded leftists. And so, figures in the press who spoke out on that, he had a kind of on-again, off-again relationship to the ACLU, but he was very attuned to that stuff, and he really didn't like criticism. And so even, what was sometimes mild criticism, or criticism from people who weren't exercising a lot of formal power, could actually really get to him.
Thank you. Monty McMurtry has been waiting very patiently. So unmute, pose a question.
We can't hear you.
Going once. All right, maybe we can try again in a moment. Christian, I believe you had a question.
Sure. Let me I think, given the subject, we have to ask you, Bev, to elaborate a little bit on the sources that you used for this biography. If you can just talk broadly about what you've had available, how your research superseded what others had been able to do, and what we are still missing in terms of the records. Greatly appreciated. Thank you.
Well, I would say to everyone out there, the man to ask some of these questions to is John Fox, who was really helpful in kind of sorting through what's there, what's not there at this point. The FBI was such a big institution, produced so much paper that, even if you spend 13 years looking at J. Edgar Hoover, you can't get through all of it. So I concentrated on a couple of things in terms of my own research. A lot of the FOIA requests that I filed were about right-wing groups and organizations, because I felt that had been a lot less studied than the history of groups on the left and the FBI's campaign against the left. I filed a lot of FOIA requests for FBI officials and for their personnel files, and that stuff was really important. There were some new sets of documents that the FBI itself has released. I mean, the FBI Vault, which is the public reading room, is great. But particularly useful to me were not only Venona, which is important for reinterpreting Hoover's knowledge during the Red Scare, but one of my favorite files was the Solo file, which is beginning in the 1950s, the FBI had a couple of key informants in the Communist Party, one of whom was its international representative, and the other of whom was its international financial courier. And all of the documents now are up online, 137 parts, I think, something like that, tens of thousands of pages. That's interesting both as a lens into an FBI operation, but also as this weirdly great social history archive, because they're traveling around meeting with Mao and Khrushchev, and so that material was great. Technologically, some of what I was able to find about his early life is just because you can now, search newspaper databases in different ways than you could a generation ago, and it was all sitting right there if you knew what to look for. And then probably the most important recent document dump, which I only got part of the way through because it's hundreds of thousands of pages, is under the JFK Assassination Act. There are lots and lots of new materials always coming out, but the Church Committee's research materials and internal correspondence is now available. And a lot of that's about the Hoover era. And some of those are unredacted versions of things we already know about, such as some of the King materials are there. So there's a big range of stuff at the FBI, at the National Archives, Hoover's own private archive. And I have to say, I was just incredibly grateful to the number of historians who had done this work themselves, right? So I really relied on, dozens and dozens, if not hundreds of case studies by other historians, and then the work of people like Ernie Lazar, who died recently, but dedicated his whole life basically to filing FOIA requests at the Bureau and making them available to all of us.
Richard Willing has also been patiently waiting. If you would unmute.
Yeah, thank you. I actually have a question that is in print there, but let me see if I can recall it. Thank you very much for the opportunity. See, as I think was mentioned, Mr. Hoover was an early and ardent proponent of advising arrestees of their rights in a process that became 55 years ago now, the Miranda warning. In fact, had a law journal article on it and had a note included, cited by Chief Justice Warren in his majority opinion in Miranda. I wonder what your thought is, what your belief is about where that impulse came from. Is it something in his background, something in his professional experience? It seems counter to the Hoover that is generally presented to us in the public.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. I think that, the Miranda decision explicitly says, the FBI has really been out front on this. And I think there are a couple of ways to think about it. I'll try to keep my answer short so that we can get in a last few questions. But one is that, Hoover's sense of professionalism was real. And he very much wanted his agents to be in contrast with local police, who he often thought of as kind of like thuggish and unprofessional. And Hoover hired lawyers mostly as his agents. And those were, a real set of commitments that I think are reflected in this kind of moment and this kind of policy. The other thing is that he also was very self-protective, and so, was eager to sort of insulate himself from criticism. And so as this kind of idea begins to circulate, he was often an early adopter of these sorts of things. I don't know, John, if you have anything to add on that particular point, but.
I don't think I have anything to add on Richard's specific question. I've been trying to search that down myself because of the fascinating footnote in the Miranda decision itself, which cites that. I will let you know should I find something. I was going to go raise a question. I found, when I started going through footnotes, I was a little puzzled why you'd cite Anthony Summers. And then I saw that you'd actually had some access to his papers. I thought you handled the whole, feather boa issue quite well. But I'd always kind of dismissed it because it seemed to me rather tabloid journalism. And I thought, the late Ethan Theo Harris also dealt with that pretty well. But what was in those papers? I'm fascinated. There's several journalists I wish their papers were out there. Kurt Gentry would be one of them, especially given all he says in his bio, which ultimately you kind of have to take on faith if it doesn't corroborate with something else. So as a source, I found that really interesting.
Yeah, so Anthony Summers, for those of you who don't know, wrote a biography of Hoover in the early 90s. British journalist. It's where the famous story about Hoover wearing a dress comes from. It's a very kind of muckraking and sometimes sensational biography of Hoover. He was incredibly generous to me, and I would say, the most valuable stuff that I went and stayed in Ireland with him for a week, and he just kind of opened up his papers. And the most important things for me were the recordings that he had of interviews with family members, people who were close to Hoover, because that, of course, generationally, I no longer had access to. And he had quoted little snippets out of that, but he actually allowed me to listen to a lot of those recordings. So those are there. And then there's a variety of other research files. I would say the main distinction is, as a journalist, he was willing to kind of quote stories that don't have a lot of documentation. I actually didn't do any interviews of a significant nature for this, in part because there aren't that many people around who would be worth interviewing, but in part because I really wanted to stick to, what we have in the documents themselves, and to do a little kind of myth and fact checking that was pretty document centered.
So this is the moment where I get my question in before we call it a day. And it's a reflection, or based on your remarks about Hoover being rooted in progressive era values of government service, efficiency, administrative state, and the like. And in my reading of FBI files in African-American history from the 20s through the 60s, what I'm struck by repeatedly is by how bad they are. The agents don't have any idea what they're looking at. They're unprepared. They hear things, they report things that don't make sense. And then when you think about the 1960s, your section in which you talk about, Hoover's understanding of the new left, he doesn't get it. And so you would think that someone committed to efficiency and kind of technocratic knowledge would actually have that knowledge and would be able to go about efficiently understanding what it is. So this individual, in the end, one could argue, serves poorly his country by not understanding the material that he's getting either legally or illicitly, and he's then in a poor position to advise political figures and or to carry out the function which he is assigned. Am I being too uncharitable here?
I think you're being fair. I think it's a little issue specific, right? In the sense that the Bureau was better at some things than at others. I think in certain ways, one of the puzzles for me about Hoover himself, and then to some degree the Bureau as a whole, is that he's, to take the question of communism, he's deep in it. He's studying it his whole life. and presenting himself as the nation's great communist expert. And yet there's some fundamental disconnect in which he can't understand it at all, and doesn't understand what would draw people to it, what would fire them up. I think in terms of civil rights movements, Black-led movements, the FBI was really had a tough time because Hoover wouldn't hire Black agents, right? And in particular, often hired very conservative white men to fill agents' roles. And so they're not going to be super well equipped to read these situations, organizations, to understand what's happening. It's one of the reasons that they rely so heavily on informers and on infiltration in many cases. But even then, you have to be able to assess the information that's coming into you. And sometimes, often in criminal law enforcement, they could be quite good at that. And then there were some fundamental disconnects between who they were studying and what they really understood.
Thank you. Unfortunately, our time is up. So I want to say my sincerest thanks to Beverly, to Ellen, to John, and Christian, to those of you in the audience who asked questions, and apologies to those whose questions we couldn't get to. Christian, back to you.
Thanks, Eric. My thanks as well to Bev, John, and Ellen, and of course, Eric, for really rich and great, terrific discussion this afternoon. Please join us next week, next Monday, December 19th, for a roundtable on Mark Silverstone's The Kennedy Withdrawal, Camelot, and the American Commitment to Vietnam. Thanks again, everyone. We're adjourned. Stay safe and good night.